Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mariam Zaidi. I am one of the programmers at the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival, and I'd really like to welcome everyone to the Artist Talk, New Media Futures, Exploring Conditions of Knowledge Production, which is a part of a large program called Absence Presence under the umbrella of RAX. This program and this panel specifically seek to reintroduce Real Asians audiences to the seminal multidisciplinary Toronto-based festival known as DESH PARDESH, which ended roughly 2 decades ago, but left an everlasting impact on its organizers and its audiences. The festival programmed works and conversations about feminism, class, sexuality, access, disability, race, caste, imperialism, and capitalism, centering the voices and experiences of underrepresented and marginalized voices within the South Asian diaspora. Desh Pardesh ran multidisciplinary workshops encouraging artistic experimentation and knowledge sharing at a time when access to formal learning and opportunities to participate in the larger mainstream cultural sector were minimal. These workshops and spaces of knowledge sharing are often spoken of and is regarded as truly transformational to everyone that's spoken about them, and as catalysts that propelled people that were mildly curious in the arts to actually pursue their own artistic practices. In this artist's talk, Golboo Amani introduces us to her body of work, which often addresses and challenges the formal conditions of knowledge production and invites us to consider the power of alternate sites of pedagogy in creating collective agency and community building. As we reflect on the importance of political art making and learning spaces that operate from an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist framework, we'd really like to encourage you to learn about the stories and histories of the lands you find yourself upon wherever you're watching from right now. Real Asian would like to honor the ongoing stories and histories of the land that our offices are located on as the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty to peaceably protect, share, and care for the land together. We acknowledge the abundance of positionalities, histories, communities, and relationships we support as a festival that platforms and elevates voices from Asian and Asian diasporic film and media arts. Regardless of our diverse pathways, we all benefit from a history of broken treaties by the Canadian government, and we reckon openly with our responsibilities as settler immigrants to this land and to its original stewards, naming the ways we are complicit in structures of white supremacy while striving to be better allies with the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Some brief housekeeping items that I'd just like to go over. A quick reminder that if you're watching from Cinesend live and want to ask questions, to please send them through in the chat or in the Ask a Question box. Cinesend is our watch portal that you're viewing all the streaming from. If you're viewing from a phone, the chat will be at the bottom of your screen. I will now introduce our wonderful moderator, Fransisco-Fernando Granados. Francisco was born in Guatemala and lives in Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. Through a range of media that extends from performance and installation to publishing and public art, he works with abstraction as a conceptual strategy to create projects that challenge the stability of practices of recognition. His work has developed from the intersection of formal painterly training, working in performance through artist-run spaces, studies in queer and feminist theory, and early activism as a peer support worker with newcomer communities in Vancouver, the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This layering of experiences has trained his institutions to seek site-responsive approaches, alternative forms of distribution, and the weaving of lyrical and critical propositions. Francisco, thank you so much for being here, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Thank you, everybody who's making this talk possible and everybody who has tuned in. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Golboo Amani. Multidisciplinary artist Golboo Amani is best known for her performance and social practice works. Amani often relies on familiar social engagements as a point of entry into her practice. Critical of systemic social patterns, the artist views social situations as ready-made sites for aesthetic intervention. Amani's work often addresses the conditions of knowledge production that render epistemic violence invisible, insignificant, and benign. By expanding sites of pedagogy to include the streets, backyards, homes, public transit, and other places, Amani intends to produce non-hierarchical pedagogical experiences that speak to collective agency and egalitarian epistemology. Amani's work has been shown nationally and internationally in venues including the Toronto Biennial of Art, Creative Time Summit, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Articule, Artist Run Center, X-Space, Hemispheric Institute, Union Gallery, Blackwood Gallery, Rats 9 Gallery, Rhubarb Festival, Fado Emerging Artist Series, Transmuted International Festival of Performance Art in Mexico City, 221A Artist Run Center, and the Live Biennial of Performance Art. Welcome, Golboo.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Francisco. And thank you to Mariam and the folks at Real Asian for inviting me for this conversation. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to begin by taking us about 13 years back. You and I met in Vancouver during our undergraduate at Emily Carr, during a wonderful summer course taught by Christina Lee-Podesva and Avat Akavan. And it was a summer course, and so I think because of that, because it wasn't in a way a university course like the others, I think that the social space really allowed us to begin a conversation and to have a conversation in a really different way. And I remember one of the things that really impressed me about your experience was the way in which you talked about Toronto, coming from Toronto, having moved to Vancouver, and the way in which you talked about Toronto as a place in which activism and alternative spaces for art and thinking took place, you know, in the form of peace protests, in the forms of street activism. And I think in a way that opened up a way for me to think about some of the work I had been doing in community as a cultural force of a different form. Can you talk a little bit about that move? Can you talk about, you know, I remember you were actually a photography student, or focused on photography, at least technically at the time. How did you come to think of your practice in the sense of that move?
Yeah. So prior to moving to Vancouver in the fall of 2007. I had been part of a really thriving community of creatives. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were capital A artists, although there were artists in that group as well. But there was this situation in Toronto where real estate, especially commercial real estate, was very cheap and very accessible. And in fact, there were folks in Kensington Market who were literally asking young creatives to come take up space in Kensington. And so I was part of a community of young folks at that point. Many of us were in our early 20s, trying to build a community or a sense of community that was independent of everything that was sort of formal and organized, as a way of creating an inclusive space. In Kensington at that time, there was a bookshop called Uprising, which was an anarchist bookshop. And eventually that bookshop stopped being like an anarchist bookshop and was sort of taken over by this group of local creatives. And we took over Uprising in this very community-centered kind of way. And so, you know, artists sold their goods. We organized in terms of political organization in this space. But the space also housed parties and events and art shows, and even became a place where people could spend the night, or moms would drop off their kids, and we would sort of, you know, it was a safe space for us to kind of exist and experiment and create. It was like an ad hoc shop, like a Zine and CD shop, as well as an event space. And as I said, there was a lot of things that happened there, and there was a lot of just unconventional learning and experimenting that was happening in that space. We were taking up space in a very different kind of way. So when I moved to Vancouver, one of the first things that struck me was how privatized Vancouver felt. And this was Vancouver leading up to the Olympics. So there were a lot of concerns and conflicts around space and access to space. And so at the time that we had met in Christina and Abbas's class, and at that time, Christina was also in residency and running something called Color School, thinking about where I had come from and the conditions of this new city that I was becoming introduced to. There were certain aspects that really stood out for me in terms of access and in terms of gathering, or what was imagined possible in terms of taking up space and running things in an independent sort of way without this umbrella of organization attached to it, but really this kind of free form possibility. And, you know, attending some of the events that Christina had organized, I felt a little bit of that in Vancouver. And so there was definitely a connection built there in terms of imagining what, you know, taking what I knew was possible in Toronto and trying to reimagine it in this new space that I was in the city of Vancouver.
How did you come to sort of think about it within your role as an artist?
You know, like you said, I came to Toronto, I came to Vancouver kind of studying and majoring in photography. And I was really interested in this notion of a collective photograph. So what did it mean to create photography collectively? Because it's oftentimes like a single point perspective that produces photography. And so I was really interested in, experimenting with the possibilities of collective photo making. And that, took a whole bunch of different shapes in my undergraduate. But as I moved towards collective photo making, as I was being influenced by the folks around me and sort of even yearning for the kind of community that I had left in Toronto, I really started thinking about social practice. And I really started thinking about how things can be made together and what space that can take up in art making that wasn't necessarily under the umbrella of, working under a collective per se, but again, sort of had this like free form ad hoc feeling to it. So really less organized and more experimental in terms of collaboration. Mainly because I felt like formulated collaborations did the same things that institutions did. And I was really interested in what other possibilities there were for collaboration.
And this way of thinking takes you to your first school outside of a school, which was the Hammock Free School. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that came about and how you brought a lot of these intuitions of interfering into the aesthetic sphere with these less formalized collaborations as a school?
Yeah. So, in the sort of tail end of my studies at Emily Carr, I was studying under Christina Lee Podespa. I was studying under Margaret Dragoo, a fantastic performance artist. And so I was thinking a lot about performativity, but also thinking about landscape, and really at a point where I am building relationships in Vancouver. When I left art school, when I finished, there was still this desire to learn more, but rather than learn in an institutional way, to glean from the people around me, which, were fascinating and brilliant. And one of the first people that really kind of came to my attention, and I believe it was through you, Francisco, was Heidi Nagdegal and the Hammock residency. And I attended a number of Heidi's events because they ran these incredible social practice events, and reached out to Heidi, sort of interested in connecting with them. And that resulted in a 2.5-month residency at the Hammock residency. I'd spoken to Heidi about wanting to do an ambitious social practice project and turning the Hammock residency, which took place in a 2-story home in East Vancouver, just off of Commercial Drive, turning that whole space into a school, including the backyard, the front porch, and even the parks nearby, and programming educational opportunities where folks could teach and learn in a kind of very free way, both financially, accessible in terms of not having to pay to take a class or a workshop, free in the sense that anyone who taught a workshop was told that they can kind of do whatever they wanted to, and to use it as an experimental opportunity to play with teaching and education. But also free in terms of how people moved in and out of that space, that they could participate as much or as little, they could witness, they could collaborate. because I really wanted to explore this idea of freedom tied to education. It's not necessarily something that I had experienced on my own up until that point. And so there was this real desire of trying to figure out what freedom in terms of knowledge production really felt like, and what happens when we carve out that sort of space. Ultimately, what happened was about a month and a half of brilliant workshops. I think we hosted about 2 workshops a week, oftentimes hosted by local artists. But there were also folks who weren't artists who were asked to come into this art space and think about workshopping through an aesthetic experience or an aesthetic lens. And so we had folks like urban farmers come and teach workshops there. I think the workshop that stood out for me the most in that entire experience was a workshop that was hosted by a young person at that time who was 7 years old, and by the name of Eddie. And I'll just sort of like share an image of Eddie, if that's okay. But yeah, I feel like Eddie really understood what was happening. He approached me at some point and asked if he could, sorry about that. Give me 1 second.
No problem.
Let me try that again. There we go. So Eddie asked if he could teach a workshop. We had flyered the community with little flyers, asking folks in the community if they wanted to teach and learn at the Hammock Free School, introducing ourselves and inviting folks to get involved. And Eddie, who was a neighbor to the Hammock residency, approached us with a proposal to teach a spray painting and stenciling workshop. And I found this to be absolutely fascinating and decided that Eddie deserved an opportunity to teach a workshop. And what was wonderful is that Eddie went back to his family and basically announced to them that he had gotten a job as a teacher, at which point, being a neighbor of the residency, they came over and were kind of asking questions about how it so happened that Eddie was going to be teaching a workshop. One of the things that we offered the folks that were teaching workshops was an exchange of produce that came from the garden just behind the Hammock residency or the farmers market that happened really close by. And Eddie negotiated his own terms, which were that he did not want produce or groceries in exchange. He wanted snacks of his choosing, and literally came up with a list of snacks that were suitable for him. And so we negotiated that exchange with Eddie. And again, it was a wonderful experience. There was also an event that happened at the Purple Thistle, which in Vancouver is a school that was run by teenagers who created a board and sort of ran kind of alternative high school type space and studio. When I approached the Purple Thistle as another free school in the community to collaborate, I had to pitch my proposal to a board of youth who were rigorous in their questions and their feedback of, their consideration of whether or not they wanted to partner and collaborate with me. And again, that was a wonderful experience. That's not something that I had assumed would happen in my process, but it really got me thinking about what kinds of schools already exist, or what kinds of spaces of teaching and learning people take up already. And so it really, that experience of creating Hammock Free School was formative and transformational for me. And actually, I haven't really gone back to photography in an intense way. This idea of social practice and creating schools has sort of taken over, and I enjoy it a lot.
Well, and it sounds like the insight of the notion of a freedom of education and the notion of not taking for granted the exchange, what the exchange is in that educational relationship, that thing that at that point might have been a kind of seed or an insight. You moved back to Toronto to do your master's at U of T, just a couple of years behind me. We also shared, Golboo and I shared the exact same education, and I'm very, which is why I think maybe it makes sense for us to be, oh, sorry, there's a siren going by. Sorry about that. Now it's gone. We share the same education, and I think I can now see that is really the kind of intervention both into the aesthetic space and into the educational space. You move here and we work together. I was curating the Fado Emerging Performance Arts series. And as it happened in a couple of instances, in one other instance, a conversation that I had with you really became the central axis for the idea for this show. And for this Emerging Performance Artist series, you began work in what was to become the School of Bartered Knowledge. Can you talk about how you took this notion of negotiating the exchange within a kind of educational relationship and took it from this sort of domestic space of the Hammock residency as out into the public in as bold a way as it would be possible in a place like Toronto, at the corner of Lansdowne and College?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting because while I was doing my master's in an institution like the University of Toronto, I was deeply conflicted, and more so because of my own trajectory with my own experience of education. But also, it felt like such an exclusive space and such an exclusive experience. And having come from my experience with the Hammock Free School, I really wanted to, again, think through what the possibilities were for exchange. And so I started thinking about exchanging knowledge and what a fair trade of knowledge would look like, and started thinking about the systems of bartering. I oftentimes take ready-made concepts as a kind of framework for creating the things that I create. These things already exist. We know what the rules of engagement are to a certain degree. And so this idea of bartering knowledge really was rooted in this notion of creating a fair trade knowledge exchange. And so the structure that I created for the School of Bartered Knowledge was made to exemplify, but also act as a structure. So the school itself was housed in this structure. The structure was designed to be kind of like mirror images of each other and sort of really focus on this notion of like horizontal learning, that there was no teacher and no student really, but that it was a sort of equal exchange, a fair exchange. And then I would literally open this structure up on the street and invite people to trade what they know with me in this street level action. And that experience was really interesting. What I did expect was that people would be reluctant to engage with me. What I learned very quickly is that if you're standing on the street with a clipboard, people will avoid you. And so, or that there were, local community members who were quite reluctant at first to engage with me. But, I was stationed just outside of a bus stop. So fortunately, I was able to, get folks to, be curious and participate. And, but the other thing that I didn't expect was the response that I got to asking folks to trade knowledge with me. And I want to say 9 out of 10 people would respond by telling me that they didn't know anything, or they would share their incredibly complex educational experiences as a way to kind of like, as a precursor to our exchange with each other. And that became really interesting to me. People confessed to dropping out of school, to being illiterate, to having learning disabilities, and so on. And, it made me very aware of how many people actually see themselves outside of the institution of education. My desire for creating the School of Bartered Knowledge came out of this personal conviction that the most important things that I've learned in my life happened at the kitchen table school, with folks in very casual conversations, that the lessons that happened at kitchen table school were, casual and accessible, but also tied to survival in many, many, many ways. And, and therefore foundational or formative or transformative for almost anyone who is learning through life and not necessarily in an institution. One of the folks I encountered was a person who told me that they did not have access to education because they were a refugee multiple times and a migrant most of their life. And we talked about that. We talked about what knowledge is valued and what knowledge is not given as much value, and spoke about how the know-how of survival is incredible knowledge that isn't necessarily valued in an institutional space, especially if it's coupled with illiteracy. So it became a very interesting experience to negotiate not just the knowledge itself, but really negotiate our expectations of what school is and what the possibilities for school are, but also to hear from so many people how they felt like outsiders when it came to school as a larger concept.
In realizing I think one of the things that's striking me hearing you talk about this now, even though I know the project quite well, is the fact that it seems like you went from sort of radically opening up the notion of what the content of the knowledge could be, right? To a certain kind of insight of the silences and the omissions in education, barriers to education. I mean, having come to Canada as a refugee and doing this work in facilitating peer support groups for other refugees and immigrants, one of the things that is often not spoken about, perhaps even as a way of keeping people in what certain structures of power feel like is one's place, is the colonial relationship. The colonial relationship is naturalized as knowledge, maybe made invisible as, and certainly turned into curriculum. One of the things that really makes colonial violence remain and be so hard set is that it is sort of made into something that everybody is supposed to know. Right around the time that we were working on that project, I remember walking down Kensington Market and you having the kernel of an idea, of an intervention into the Settlers of Catan game. And over the course of many years, many conversations, and what, to me, the thing that I've learned from it is a radical flexibility and a radical rethinking of authorship and the notion that an artist is there to make decisions about where the work goes. You created Unsettling Settlers. What can you tell us about that project?
Well, I want to preface this conversation by saying that my own experience with education was very complicated and, very violent, actually, as a child who was an immigrant, but also as a sibling to a person with disabilities. I was pulled into and witnessed to all kinds of violence perpetrated on to us as very young people. And so from a very young age, I knew that there was this possibility of violence being embedded into education. And even though it took me a very long time to find the words to describe that experience, and to even just find people that believed that a childhood experience of education could be incredibly violent, I think especially now there is far more understanding about what the potential harms of systemic institutionalized education for young people can be. And what I want to say is, while it's incredibly horrific, it never sort of surprised me as an adult because of my experience as a young person. So I think my critique of institutional spaces is very much part of coming to terms with the experience that I had in pedagogy as a young person, or the kind of pedagogical violence or epistemic violence that I experienced. Not just pedagogical in terms of like what happened at school, but epistemic also in terms of like our knowledge not being valued. So in our contributions, even as young folks, not being valued. So our perspective, our lived experience, and so on. And then add severe ableism on top of that, and the experience that I witnessed of witnessing my sibling move through the education system really, informed my understanding of what institutional spaces are capable of in terms of harm and violence. So when it came to thinking through unsettling settlers, I was first introduced to Settlers of Catan, and being a bit of a gamer, at least a board gamer, I was, totally entertained by this board game. But at some point, it became obvious to me that games being pedagogical tools, that this game, Settlers of Catan, was teaching us something, even in the delight and entertainment of it. And when I asked myself, what is Settlers of Catan teaching us really? The answer was to be more effective settlers. And being in this time and place and having learned what I have learned about being a settler on this land, I really set out again to use this game as a potential ready-made for talking through and learning new strategies for being in this place. So Settlers of Catan is a landscape with a very specific narrative, and in order to dominate or win in this environment, you have to play by the rules of the game. Christina Lee Podeswa is the first person who introduced me to Pierre Bourdieu, and I followed up with reading even more Pierre Bourdieu and thinking through the sort of expanded field and the rules of the game and what it means to be an insider or outsider within this field. The process of making Unsettling Settlers was a long and slow process. It involved first holding space for collective research, which looked like play test sessions where we would hold safe and critical space for playing Settlers of Catan, especially POC folks or BIPOC folks, but more so POC folks, and then talking through those game sessions, talking about what possible interventions we would want to see happen in this game. And that was about a year-long process of just playing the game with different groups of people and sitting and talking through what we imagined for, possible changes for this game. And then producing a prototype and beta testing that prototype for another year with hundreds of people playing the game and offering feedback about the game. And then finally it being produced into an artist multiple and circulating as an event where folks play the game and also circulating as this artist multiple. And for me, it goes back to that that question that I had as a photo student, which was how do we collectively make a photograph? And when it came to Unsettling Settlers, I was really thinking about social practice from the research and development. So what does it look like to engage in social practice from the research and development stage of making an artwork, so that it's not this ready-made framework that folks engage with, but it's actually in the formulation of the work itself that folks have a say. And that was a wonderful experience, this idea of kind of collectively arriving to this work, of having multiple voices be part of the formulation of this work, was probably the most enjoyable part. And again, because it involved so many people and these sort of like long drawn out stages, it happened in this very slow way, which I appreciate a lot. I realize now, especially that I am a sort of like slow moving person in terms of actualizing things or moving through things. And you know, that may have contributed also to the difficulty that I experienced in my education as well, because education is tied to capitalism in terms of productivity and output. And so if you're not moving quickly, you sort of fall behind or are excluded. And so drawing things out and making things slow is one of the ways that, or one of the strategies that I found really allows people to access what you're hoping to share out there.
Well, and perhaps that's where the logic of the ready-made can be intervened upon. You know, like one of the kinds of ready-mades that were sort of devised was this notion of a rectified ready-made, where some kind of inscription by the artist would shift the nature of it. And I think the way in which you allow for that process-based practice to open up these everyday processes, or these things that seem quite familiar, generate a kind of possibility for redistribution, even thinking of the ways in which the sale of the multiple, you know, you redirect that into, you know, efforts, indigenous and anti-colonial efforts. We have about 13 minutes until we have to wrap. There are a couple of questions. I want to maybe hang on to something about this question of redistribution and maybe see what other questions we got if you want to sort of fold it in. Somebody was wondering, actually, something that you've sort of addressed, but in case there's anything else you want to say, if you could speak a little bit about the view of the collective photograph now, you know, and how your view has changed of this approach.
That's a good question. You know, when I was working through this idea of the collective photograph, I was appropriating images from the internet. I was asking folks to co-create images with me. I was, you know, initiating certain visual conversations, and then folks would sort of jump on board and contribute to those conversations. And I feel like what's happened is that there's been an evolution. I think I've learned to trust the collaborative process more. Going back to this idea of alternative forms of distribution or redistribution, I really use the open source tech model as a model for social practice. You know, open source is this notion of creating a source code in technology, and then folks adding to that code, like being able to access the code for free in exchange for adding to that code and making it better, making it stronger and more useful. And so that's sort of my philosophy in general when it comes to social practice, is taking this open source model as an example of what is possible when you kind of open up the research and the information and the thoughts that you're having to a community and asking them to help you generate something even more complicated, even more thought out as a collective. And so, you know, where in my photography stages, I was really asking folks to fit themselves, very social practice, fit themselves into a framework that I had created. I feel now I'm more interested in this notion of what are the possibilities and what are other people's imaginations going to be, you know, be bringing or contribute to this collective thing that we're doing. So it's more like an invitation to, you know, it's more like Hammock Free School, where it's an invitation to bring in your own knowledge and teach and learn in this free way rather than inserting someone into a framework that I've already sort of set out an intention and, even a sort of finalized idea of what it'll look like. I had no idea what unsettling settlers would look like. I had no idea how it would function. And in terms of it being a game, game designers told me for the first 2 years that this game was very broken in terms of it didn't function the way that games are supposed to function. It still doesn't. It still, disrupts the expectations that gamers have of what a game is supposed to look and feel like. So I would say that that's sort of the shift that I've made.
Well, and in a way, thinking of the sort of multiple nature of photography, or this notion of, and even thinking of the context of Real Asian as a film festival and the reproducibility of it, it sounds to me like your work becomes a proposition rather than a model. Looping it back into ideas of the open source. Another question that we have is, you spoke about aesthetics when it comes to creating spaces of knowledge production and the importance of aesthetics. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And can I add something to that question, kind of from my bag? I think for me, the thing about having come up through and having, in fact, sort of been able to make myself an artist by working in community, working part-time in nonprofit, doing community development, I've always felt like my critique of sort of brand name social practice was that, at some point it felt like there was a certain tension between the artwork and the process, or the artwork and the community. And it was very easy for an artist who claims social practice to sort of throw the community for the sake of the artwork, for the aesthetic, for the aesthetic to determine what the process is. Whereas when we were working in community, and especially when you work in community for the sake of your own survival, for the sake of making spaces that you don't have elsewhere in your life, all that matters is process. Mm-hmm. So yeah, can you elaborate on this notion of the aesthetic, particularly when it comes to the broader field of social practice, and how I feel you do things a little bit differently, or well, actually a lot different?
Yeah, I would almost say that my work for a very long time lacked aesthetic in terms of like, there's no like signature or definitive way that my work looks or fits into. I can't, I find that folks have a really hard time when it comes to, the aesthetic of my practice, connecting things to each other. It's sort of all over the place. It's a bit of a hodgepodge. And truthfully, I'll sort of like credit that sort of flexibility to Heidi and, Nagdegal, and having this very DIY hodgepodge aesthetic. I realized that, I really appreciate that. But learning and schooling and education is aesthetic anyway. Certainly when we're younger, there is an aesthetic attached to it. And it's, visual, it's performative. We're singing, we're dancing, we're moving. And it's all tied to learning. When I was learning my, my heritage language as a young person, not living in my, my homeland, I learned everything through song and through art. And so I knew, again, at a really young age, that aesthetic was part of the learning experience. And so I never really separated those two. And again, being someone who went to Persian school on Saturdays with other, immigrant children, like that was very hodgepodge and really sort of DIY and sort of thrown together as well. So there, there's a part of me that isn't necessarily looking for things to look really neat and clean and wrapped up. I kind of like it when when my work is sort of riddled with flaws, it kind of takes the ableism out of it. It kind of leaves space for improvement. It leaves space for imperfection. And I really enjoy that. I think that that's more important than a sort of fine-tuned aesthetic, at least in terms of my social practice. But the other thing that I want to say is, all of the tools of education are tied to aesthetic practices. When we think of things like games, they're totally aesthetic experiences. And when we arrive to games, even though they're learning tools, and we're learning to do things and condition ourselves in certain ways, we're doing it in a performative way. We're arriving ready to perform as our avatar, as our character, as our gamer self. For me, what is sort of important in that aesthetic experience is acknowledging how much teaching and learning, or how much education is actually care work, and trying to find how that is related to also joy and enjoying ourselves through that process as well. I think that there is the multiple has an aesthetic, but if you have the multiple, you'll also notice that there are flaws and there are funny little things built into that aesthetic as well, so that it's not this neatly packaged something. It's always, for me at least, I'd prefer things to be rough around the edges. I'd prefer for people to imagine how, in that open source process of things, what they would contribute or how they would improve something. So this idea of making it perfect, even for myself, works against my desire for people to imagine their involvement. Yeah.
And that is perhaps the shift from a kind of more modernist idea of an aesthetic as a seamless thing into, every single thing that disrupts that smoothness in a way is a point of entry, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, I really like a messy process. I like to get my hands dirty, but in this way of meeting folks, and again, like playing with the possibilities and allowing somebody else to take over for a moment, and giving many people opportunities to take over and imagine how they would want this work to look, and then actually implementing that into the work, so that it's not just this like theoretical contribution, but that folks can invest in a social practice experience where they actually see what they've invested in the work itself. That's the other thing, is like, to me, social practice only makes sense if the outcome reflects all of the authors that were part of that practice, rather than this idea that, again, like that I'm some kind of puppet master and that I know what's going on before it's even going to happen. It's a little unnerving to not know what's going to happen, but it's also part of the adventure and the excitement. And just to go back to what DESH PARDESH was doing and Real Asian honoring the work that they were doing, it was ad hoc. It was, calls from community that really sort of shaped, what that experience was for the folks that were organizing and involved in DESH PARDESH. And I think that organic structure and that sort of like fluidness to moving forward is what made it magical. That's how I felt about that space in Kensington Market and Uprising. It just happened, and then things kept happening, and it felt magical because we had no control over it. There was no one really directing where things would go. And I think that there is some magic to sort of like doing things in a collaborative way, that where we're not quite sure where we'll end up, but we know that we're committed to this journey together.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. Magic and possibility. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, folks out there. I want to thank you, Golboo, for this wonderful conversation. We hope to continue this conversation on Real Asians Forum on Discord. If you aren't on the Discord yet, there is a link in the chat, and there will be a QR code posted in a moment. You can scan the QR code to fill out a brief survey as well. Again, thank you, Golboo. Thank you, Rana and Tanya from Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Services for the backend support. Thank you, Samir, Mimi, and Joe. Just a reminder that Real Asian is still going on until November 19th. You can learn more about all the programming available and how to buy a ticket at realasian.com/festival. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you take care, and thank you again. Anytime I get a chance to talk to you, I'm happy.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Real Asian and Mariam and our ASL signers and our live captioners, and to you, Francisco. I've, again, thoroughly enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariam, as well, yes. Thank you, everybody. I think we're at 6, so I think that's it. Have a great day.